Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Tonight, we are going to dive into a topic that is near and dear to my heart, testing. And more importantly, testing with a couple libraries that I enjoy using quite a bit, Moq and AutoMocker. Just full disclosure, AutoMocker is a library where I'm also one of the maintainers on it. I'm not the sole maintainer. There's a few other people on there as well. But I do definitely contribute to it. So if we get time, I was going to dive in and also show some of the upcoming new features that are forthcoming in the next one. Hey Andrew, welcome. Always good to have you. So we will be poking at that, and then also I'm going to spend a bit of time focusing on AutoMocker, its usage. I've been professionally using it with more and more teams, and oftentimes, unfortunately, our documentation sucks. So this is going to be V1 of documentation, of at least having a section of video that I can point people to and say, hey, here is a section on AutoMocker. If you're curious what it is, why it works, let's go ahead and do that. So let's dive in. So I'm just going to dump a bunch of links right out the gate, right? So I'm starting from one of my .NET templates. So if you want to follow along at home, that's that one. The mocking library of choice here is going to be Moq, M-O-Q. There are plenty of mocking libraries out there for the .NET space, a lot of them out there. Pick your favorite. I will warn you, the AutoMocker library that I'm going to show off is very much specific to Moq, M-O-Q. There are similar libraries from other people out there as well that do something similar. So I will show you what all is in AutoMocker and some of the things that maybe start to differentiate it from some of the other ones. And then, you can take your pick. And then finally, I don't know why that thing has the tab up like that. We're going to just trim that off. AutoMocker. And look, there's me. Yay, me. And there's my colleague, Adam. Yay, Adam. Okay. I can't cheer him too much. He might let it go to his head. Okay, so starting off, this is my default kaboo.wpf .NET new template. I didn't do anything fancy. I can show you the terminal. I literally just ran .NET new off to the races, right? Great, fine. It spits out a WPF app. We can launch it if we care to see it real quick. It's nothing overly special, but it's just significant enough to actually matter. Should have compiled it ahead of time. There we go, right? There's a button. You can click it. You can clear the count. You can click the button again. Huzzah. There's some stuff in here. It all works. Great. That's what we want to see in a sample. Something small enough that it makes sense, but big enough to where we can actually do it. And there are some tests already in here for this view model. We are not going to currently use them because they kind of cheat and skip ahead. And so I figure we will go through and do this. I also just installed the latest VS Preview. And there's this cool little feature up at the top where it shows you where you're at. I think I like it. I think I like it. I'm not sure, but I think I like it. It's kind of nice to be able to always keep a little bit of context about what you're inside of or where you're at without needing to scroll up. So it's kind of cool. Okay, so we're going to start off. We're going to add a new class. Let's go with example test. Yeah, it is. It does take a little adjustment, and I run way too many of the preview features, and so I was actually bit earlier this week showing off some features to somebody, and then they fired up their Visual Studio and didn't have the same features, and we went, what? Turns out it was a preview feature, and I just assumed it was normal. So I get a little too adjusted to preview mode. Like the preview Visual Studio is great. Anyone can go out and download it. It does it's great about 95% of the time. The other 5% of the time make me question why I'm running preview and want to go back to the actual released one. But most of the time the preview builds are just fine. They're not that bad. I even run them in my day-to-day. Okay, so we are going to start here. I am going to start with the what of testing, and then we are going to circle back to the why, because the why often elicits a lot more discussion, and I've found that starting with what ends up making things a little bit nicer. So in general, I would strongly advocate that your test class usually should mirror the thing that they're testing. So you'll hear people use the word sut. Dang, Copilot, seriously? Yes, thank you, Copilot. I was looking to define the acronym, you show off. SUT is an acronym that stands for System Under Test. And if you ever forget that, apparently you can just type this in. And apparently Copilot is just fine. Copilot, you want to do everything for me? That's NUnit. Like, I don't know where you think you're going with this. Yeah. Yeah, shut up, Copilot. I'm the programmer. Thank you very much. No, we're not doing that. I am going to point out just the packages that I do have installed, Moq, and the AutoMock library. I will be using XUnit for this. You do not have to pick your unit testing library of choice, but please pick XUnit, NUnit, or MSTest. Like, there's really not a reason to pick anything else. One of those three, like, if you're in the big three, you're probably fine. I also am going to point out I do have some global using set up, so you will not see most using statements show up at the top because I've got global usings defined here, and we are off to the races. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to test here. So the easiest thing to go through and test is the commands on this view model, and in particular, this thing has a command called increment count command. In case you missed it, last week's stream was on Community Toolkit with Avalonia. I cover a little bit of this, but this is source generated. So you can see there is increment count command is in fact a property that exists on this instance. You just don't see it because the attribute is triggering a source generator. So we're going to start there, and we're just going to validate that this command behaves as we expect. Yeah, this stuff, there's not going to be a lot of WPF specific stuff, a tad MVVM, because part of the motivation for why you build an app with MVVM is testability. There's several bonuses to it, but one of the big ones is the separation of concerns allows you to write tests. And if you don't need tests, then like you've given up a big portion of what MVVM gets you. So not complete. It's not like you're not getting any benefit, but you're giving up a big chunk of it. Okay, so increment count command increments the count. So we're going to start with this. So fact, and then Copilot's going to write the whole thing for me. Public void increment count command on execute. And actually, I'm gonna do this. Increments count. And I can't spell, so hopefully I got that mostly correct. Okay, so Copilot's immediately showing the fact that it's an AI and not a real boy. So sut gets new. And actually, you know, setting the count initially is probably not a bad idea. Okay, Copilot, I gave you the name of the test. Can't you write it? Take that, Copilot. Get in line, AI. Nope, still wrong, Copilot. Still wrong. I'll come back to that, Noel, in a minute. And then assert. Thank you. That much you got right. So there is a common pattern in unit testing that is worth knowing. It is called arrange, act, and assert. And really what this comes down to is for the arrange portion, you do whatever setup is needed for your test. The act portion is generally supposed to be very small and logically one thing. For your act portion, you really want it to be one logical thing. I'm not saying one line of code or one method invocation or that kind of thing, because that's a little too dogmatic and there's cases where that doesn't work. But one logical thing. And then finally, any relevant assertions. And in this case, there is only kind of one thing for us to assert on. The other thing to note is I usually tell people name your test methods with these three things in mind, right? Oftentimes I will name my test method, you know, we'll do this, method name, stop it, Copilot, right? So here, we're going to do this. I'm going to see if I can get this. Act, arrange, assert, something like that. And in this case, it's a little awkward because the arrange doesn't really exist in this case, right? Because in this case, on execute, I don't know, with set count, we could do so. We could argue that that might be a little more clear. And then assert. And really, when you name your tests like this, one of the things that it gives you is it gives you a checksum or some level of validation that somebody reading your test can validate, does the contents of the test match the name? And hopefully this is something that's done on code review, is does the test name make sense? If I read the name of your test, do I know without looking at the contents what I expect that test to be doing? Right? Like in theory, if I collapse your test down like this, can I, look at your thing here? And again, pretend like this says main window view model tests. I just can't name it that because I've got an existing one. Pretend like that's what it says. And then increment count command. Okay. So that's what we're testing is this command. Great. On execute. And actually, maybe it should really be something like that. With set count, so I know that there's going to be something setting an count as part of this test. And then the expectation increments count. Okay? So I can see there's my act, there's my arrange, there's my assert, we're off to the races. And usually when people show testing, this is kind of the pattern they go with, and then oftentimes they stop. And this is horrible. Okay, now we're going to go make this more complicated. We could write more tests around this. We could say, well, there's a can execute. We should validate that the can execute of the command, returns false once we get to 5 and that kind of thing. Great. We're going to call that an exercise for the reader. I trust most people can extrapolate from here up to that. Let's go and actually do something slightly more complicated though. Okay, so we're gonna come in here and we're gonna pretend that we're gonna add, public interface web service. All right. Let's see. Task of string get data async. All right. So we're gonna pretend like we've got this web service thing. Yeah. Go ahead and move it. Great. Thanks. You're a doll. Okay. Public class my web service. Web service. And we're going to go through and do this. Implement interface. And then in this case, what we're going to do is await task delay of time span from seconds 10. Oh, I just realized something. I missed the most important thing. Return hello. Oh, yeah, that'll work. Thank you, Copilot. You're awesome. I should have probably pointed out running of the test. That is probably very important. So once you compile the project, and full disclosure, I'm running I believe, is it Pro or Enterprise that I have? I don't remember. Enterprise. So just going to caution, some features I'm going to show you may not have if you don't have a high enough SKU. Just going to throw that out. There's at least one I'm about to show that I know is not in the lower SKUs, but worth knowing about. So from the menu up at the top, Test Explorer is your friend. We'll drag this guy back on over. Boop, boop, boom. This guy here will often go through and show you all of your tests. Huzzah. Kind of some key things to know about up here is the group by, which is incredibly helpful. Sometimes people forget that you can actually group tests by different things. Specifically, depending on your testing framework, there is ways to group things by trait. By duration is oftentimes something that people forget about. I oftentimes will group by duration when I'm annoyed at how long my pipeline takes and I want to figure out why some of my tests are long. You sort by duration and then you go say, okay, who's the biggest offenders? And then I'm going to start chopping down the tree there. Right, and start going through. So having this stuff available, so group by button is your best friend. These are just like expand collapse buttons. They're useful, whatever. And then you can also create playlists. So if you decide, you know what, really all we want to do is right now we're going to be ignoring the main window view model test. I just want to focus on these. We can just like add these guys to a playlist. And now I've got just my testing examples linked in over here. Right, and you've got your little pencil button here, or if you want to hide or show different ones, you can say, oh, okay, now bring these ones into my playlist too. So we can pick these stuff up, these guys up as we go. Come in, great. We've got a nice simple thing. Big play button lets you execute the thing that's selected. The thing that's selected is hierarchical. So if you pick on one versus the run all button, and there's obviously lots of different things in here. I will also point out the hotkeys on here are really useful, especially the repeat last run, Control RL. This is very handy because quite often you're iterating on a test rapidly and kicking it off. The other thing that's worth calling out in here is the right click menu for being able to run tests, debug tests. Oftentimes I find these ones are very useful. These ones are also context sensitive. So if you right click inside of a test, run tests is going to kick off this test. If you right click up here, it's going to run all tests for the class. Also quite helpful. It's just kind of quick and dirty. And then if you've got these little, hang on, I don't have Zoom it running. If you have these little icons here, these little guys are clickable. And you can go whoop and hit run, debug, etc. The difference between run and debug is the same as F5 versus Control F5 up here when you're executing. It's do you want to debug or text? Do you want to stop at breakpoints and that kind of thing? Or do you just want to send it? Right? And oftentimes with tests, I just send it. Last thing I'm going to point out, and this is probably one of the best things ever, is, and I believe this is enterprise SKU only. Don't quote me on that, but I know it's not in community. I don't remember whether it's pro or enterprise that you pick it up. Hey Izzy, we are doing testing with Moq and AutoMocker. But this feature here, the live unit testing, is incredibly valuable. I am curious why my thing is disabling it and why it is not enabled, because I'd really like to show it off. Thank you. Start. There we are. Okay. So it's going to ask me where I want to save my stuff. Great. Defaults sound wonderful. And then you'll note that the live unit testing window looks remarkably similar once it gets going to the main window that I have over here. The key difference here is the main Test Explorer. I'm going to put the Test Explorer in the playlist side by side. These guys, I choose when to run. I click, I press button, I do keystroke, test take off to the races. Live unit testing, it just goes, right? So you'll note when live unit testing starts, I immediately pick up these little check boxes on the side, and I'm going to go backspace 3, and I'm going to put my hands up. You'll note I haven't even saved the file. That's what live unit testing gives you. Is it will constantly be evaluating your changes, determining which tests and code is affected, and then rerunning those. There are times it does get itself wrapped around the axle, loses its mind, doesn't know what it's doing. You make a change, it didn't catch it because it's dealing with a lot of these concurrent saves and changes, and it goes, I'm confused. Stop, start. Problem usually goes away. The other thing to be aware of is on your output window down below, this is something that's oftentimes missed by people. If you've got a test that's causing like an out of memory or a Stack Overflow, oftentimes these tools don't know how to handle that. They go, the test process that I executed is just dead. And it went away and I don't know what to do. And people are like, I don't know how to fix that. Come to your output window. There are output options for live unit testing and tests. This is often where you will start to see relevant output, especially if your test host is crashing or something isn't working. Like sometimes I'll see people say, I right-clicked and hit run, but then it didn't do anything. Well, yeah, it's because it doesn't know how to handle when it says start process. The last thing that's worth calling out, and the only other way that I think is worth running tests, running tests from the command line is literally just .NET test. Same as .NET build, all the things, you get all this stuff out, huzzah, huzzah. Okay, enough about actually running tests. Let's talk about actually doing tests. So I'm going to play with live unit testing on because, in my opinion, it just makes life so much easier. So much easier. Did I close it? I think I did. Dang it. One should leave the live unit testing window open but we'll go through and see this. So next thing we're going to do is we are going to give ourselves another relay command. Wow, Copilot. That's pretty good. You're an idiot, but that's pretty good. Okay, so why Copilot's dumb is we don't want doing this type of instantiation. If I were to see a method like this in real code, I would question what the point of the interface is. Because usually the idea of an interface is to establish a contract. And if you're just going to instantiate the instance right there, this is like buying you nothing. Like at all, like just kill the interface. You don't need it, right? So we're going to actually make it useful because it will serve our purposes. Okay, and then here, create an assigned field, add null check, and then we're going to come over here. We're going to go here, and then let's give ourselves somewhere to put it. We'll do an observable property, private string data. That sounds great. We'll do something like data gets data. Okay. So now let's imagine we wanted to go through and actually do the testing here. This is where the separation of concerns and the DI and the testing and all of this come together. Again, if you're not going to write tests, this type of structure adds a level of complexity and indirection that often make the code more difficult for somebody. If you are not bothering to write tests, just straight new up your service right here and do the work that you need, right? You're doing a quick one-off. There's no point in all this extra ceremony if you're not going to actually, do the stuff that the ceremony is intended to do. Okay, so we're going to go through web service get data async. It's going to pull back some data, assign it to the property, huzzah. Right, so we will come through here, and Copilot, I would like you to show off for me. So public void, what was I already forgot the name of the command. I can't remember what this does. Is it smart enough to drop the async? Get data, oh, it is. Oh, wow. Community toolkit, I love you. You are so awesome. Get data command on execute retrieves data. I am going to somewhat omit the arrange portion from the name of my test because at this point there's not really much there, right? So we're going to go ahead and do arrange. Okay, sure. We can do some expected data. You're getting closer. Okay. 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 That's pretty good, Copilot. That's pretty good. I almost had to think for a minute. Okay, so let's discuss what Copilot did because clearly Copilot has already figured out which end is up. And we're just going to do mock of I web service. And then this will be a good introduction to Moq and a bunch of its APIs. See? Test goes green. Huzzah. We should also validate. Hey, Copilot, validate that the Moq was actually invoked. Validate the Moq was invoked. Do it. Thank you. Okay. See? We don't write code anymore. We write comments and we let the AI write the code. So with Moq, the idea here is to test main window view model, we need something that is an iWeb service. Now, there's obviously a real implementation that was written that's just going to return some hard-coded data. But for our purposes, we can imagine that this class might have an HTTP client. It's probably going to do some work, right? It's going to take some amount of effort to go through and do. And really what we want to do, and the whole reason why we put in an interface rather than just using the concrete class, is we said, you know what? What I would really like to do is I would like to be able to go through and put in a different implementation. Now, we could write a private class testing web service, iWeb service, right? We could build this whole thing up. And often, and you know, we can make this do whatever we need. Don't be the graph SDK and remove your interface. Well, we're going to get to deleting the interfaces in a moment, so don't get too excited. So we could go through and build out one of these things, and we could have it, you know, return hello world and do all the needful stuff. The problem is in a real app, this starts to take a bit of time, especially if you're going to just kind of put in worthless implementations that are things like return task from result, you know, my result, right? If we were to plug this in and say, well, okay, rather than using the mock, what we'd rather do instead is we'd rather go, we're going to just comment this out. Wait, did it do it for me? Copilot, if you're going to start ruining my examples, I'm going to be, okay, good. I was worried you're going to actually do the right thing. Like if it can do the wrong code based upon what I'm saying, I'm going to be real impressed. Right? We could plug something like this in. Right? Expected data now changes to be something like my result. I think I want live unit testing. It is awesome. Like absolutely amazing. And this is obviously not going to work because it's acting on the mock. The other thing, it's not quite code coverage, right? It gives you kind of this line by line indication of what was executed. It's poor man's code coverage. I will often use it to find things that I haven't covered. But if you see the red green, you got to take it with a little bit of grain of salt because it's not real code coverage. So, but it's good enough to give you a pretty good idea. And oftentimes just seeing the red X or the green check and what line it occurs on is often good enough for me to realize, oh, yep, I made this mistake in my test. It's wonderful. If you don't have somebody who's willing to spring for a Visual Studio license, the other popular one, and this has existed for years, nCrunch is it's basically the thing that Microsoft ripped off when they built live unit testing was nCrunch. nCrunch has been around for a very long time, and this is what they do. And they're real good at it. So it also has extra features beyond what live unit testing does and whatnot. Like nCrunch is pretty slick. It's really slick. So if you like the live unit testing experience, but can't get an enterprise license to Visual Studio, nCrunch is often an alternative. Actually, let me look. What is their pricing? I'm not actually even sure about that. Yeah. Named user. It ain't cheap. I'll put it that way. It ain't cheap. But it's really good, and it's technically cheaper than an enterprise license of Visual Studio. Obviously, depending on who's footing the bill where. Okay, so, but we could go through and build out, people will call these things test doubles, is I think the most universal name that I've seen. People will sometimes throw in the word substitute. I've seen people also call these things mocks as well. I don't like that because I think that muddies the water. Like, sure, like technically you're correct, but it's like I feel like that term gets overloaded then, and then it gets real confusing. So I oftentimes will call these a test double, and build those out that way. So this is a thing we could do. The problem is writing this is a lot of code. Writing this is a lot less code. We like that. This is functionally what the mock library gives you. Is it gives you a mock class that is generic, and whatever you put as the T, what it's going to do is it's going to generate something kind of like this. Imagine taking whatever you put as the T and making that the base of some generated object, where this thing then says, okay, I'm going to override everything on the T, and I'm going to give you things where you can do like setups and control the returns and then validate how many times it was called. So it basically builds up all of this stuff. Like you could imagine this thing was validating the number of times this was invoked. Imagine this thing has a public int get data async call. Dang, Nav, you Copilot. Show off. Okay, Copilot, now use the assert. Assert equal 1, and then Let's see. Oh, I gotta extract this guy out. Let's see here. Var service. Right, so we're basically re-implementing everything that Moq gives us by hand. Service. Right, so now we can guarantee that one, the method was invoked. It was invoked exactly one time, and that is basically identical to what Moq gives us here. Can you set up multiple times to override multiple method returns, or do you have to change something? Great question. Great question. We were going to dive into that in just a second. But you can start to see that the idea with Moq is to make having to write all of these by hand a lot less painful and a little bit more auto-gen magic-y. Right? It's not source generated. It uses a library in the hood called Castle Dynamic Proxy. Think of this as code gen at runtime. So Castle Dynamic Proxy has been around for years. It's stable. It's awesome. A lot of mocking libraries use it under the hood. Its API is just miserable to work with, and that's where every mocking library comes in and goes, I know, I can make a pretty face to put on top of this. That's it. Right? Okay, so setup sequence, I think. Oh, Victor, you are on point. Yes. And anything uses it. Yeah, exactly. So let's take a look. So when you go through and create a mock, the easiest way to create a mock is just straight up to invoke its constructor. But let's start at the API here. There are a couple things you can imagine, because if we imagine our mock down here, by doing nothing, something using this service is always just going to get this task from result, right? But when Moq is generating the override, because it's going to gen its version of this testing web service class all by itself, for methods that are not void returning, it has to do something when you call it, right? You just can't have a non-void returning method not return something. So the default behavior of Moq is, okay, if you don't tell me anything about the method, what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a default value. And I'm doing the air quotes there because it is not doing, return default task of string, right? This would be bad, right? The compiler's already yelling at me going, hey, are you sure you meant to do this? This is probably not what you meant. It's like, right. Because the default of task of string is null. And if you return null from a method like this, it's going to throw. And that's probably not what you were going for, right? Like that's if you end up awaiting on a null return, that's not right. So it's a little smarter when I say returns default. And in this case, it's going to go, okay, hang on. This is an asynchronous method. It's a task of string. Got it. What we're going to do is we're going to return, task from result of string, and we'll return the default of string. We're going to be a little bit smarter. Oh, Castle Windsor, Izzy, you're dating yourself a little bit, but yes. So when it's returning and figuring out what the default behavior is, it goes, okay, I'm going to be a little bit smarter. I'm not just going to blindly do this. So if it's one of the well-known things like task or value task or whatnot, I'll return a value. It's just the value inside of that task is going to be the default of string, which is null, right? This is one of the areas that bites really hard with nullable reference types, because I have nullable reference types turned on, right? This is not nullable string. But if I do nothing with my mock, I am going to get back a null, right? That is not going to work. This is going to end up saying, well, so, and more explicitly, if I get rid of this setup, right, where I've controlled it, I can type. If I get rid of this setup, the return here is going to be a null on a method that is explicitly declared non-nullable. This is not great, right? This is one of the drawbacks, and there's no good way around this. Ish. One of the options that's worth knowing about is on your Moq's constructor, there is a Moq behavior enum. And you'll note there's default, loose, and strict. Okay? These guys. And the default Moq behavior, hang on. We do this. We go and look at it. There's secretly, even though there's 3 enum members, there's really only 2. Right? Strict, loose, and default, which is also loose. And I personally abhor the fact that the enum's declared this way, because, yeah, it feels weird that the default enum member is not the 0th member and that kind of thing. So, yeah, Moq behavior.default is not the same as default Moq behavior. And that makes me twitch a little bit. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. And if you don't specify anything to your constructor, you are going to get the behavior of default, which is loose. Now, for anyone who didn't catch it right away, the difference between these two, a loose Moq says, go ahead and do that default return type behavior, right? And that's what most people are familiar with Moqs, is getting that kind of default return if I didn't do a setup. The alternative is you can say, no, I'm going to do a strict Moq. And that means if anything gets invoked and I didn't do a setup on it, just throw, straight throw. I want your default implementation of all of these methods to be just throw. Oh, Mr. X, thank you. I don't know if you caught it at the beginning. AutoMock is also one that I'm a maintainer on, so I'm a little biased. Heavily biased. But worth noting that you do have the option of a strict Moq as a choice. This can be quite helpful, especially because it is very hard in a unit test to assert a negative, right? There is not a great way to say, I want to write a test to assert that something doesn't happen, right? It's not always trivial to do that. The closest thing we can get is usually a strict Moq or a setup that always throws or similar, and say, okay, that's probably good enough. That's probably the closest we're going to get. You can also do on the verify, you can do like a verify times, what is it? None, never, there. One of the N words. This is the closest thing we can usually get to verify negative, but it's not. Oftentimes when people want to verify negative things, they're usually things that aren't easy to test for, right? I want to verify that it doesn't, use a config value. Really? How do you verify that some code doesn't use a config value? The best you can do is, if you can control the access to the config, say, well, on access throw, my test didn't crash, so it probably didn't throw. Like, those are the types of things that start to get really awkward, right? And I'm going to put this guy back here. So worth knowing about that on the constructor. The last overload on the constructor that people need to be highly aware of, I guess we'll do 2, is where is the use private? Oh, it's not on here. Oh, that's right. I'm getting confused. The arguments, we'll go there, is sometimes you need to pass arguments to a constructor. Now, in this case, we are mocking an interface. Interfaces currently in C# have no constructor. I don't worry. I don't think there's any plans to give them constructors. Hopefully, any C# team people are listening. Please do not do that thing. Let's see. This guy is failing because it is in fact called once. And there we go. Green. Perfect. But it is very possible we may realize, you know what? There are occasionally times where putting something behind an interface doesn't make sense. I oftentimes will, in interviews, I like to quiz people on interfaces because I think they are deceptively difficult. Most developers can usually, like, if I ask about an interface, they will give me the academia level answer, right? An interface establishes a contract. In .NET, sometimes people use them to get kind of multiple inheritance type behavior. If they get really fancy, they start talking about like default interface implementations, that kind of thing. That's great, right? And usually that's the minimum answer I'm willing to accept from somebody on interfaces, right? Give me the academia-based answer for interfaces. The problem is the academia-based answer misses the mark completely on the point of when and why to use an interface, right? You can ask the question of, hey, when should you use an interface, or why should you use an interface? And oftentimes, I love watching people squirm on this question. It's great. Hopefully, nobody who I interview in the future is watching this stream, because I'm about to hand you gold. The when and the why to use an interface. Again, oftentimes you get the academia-based answer of, well, you want to hide away the actual implementation details, and you get, some answer about like encapsulation, or, you want to give yourself an injection point for mocking. That's another thing that people say. If your reason for using an interface is an injection point for mocking, I will argue you've missed the mark. Right? It's not quite there, because the problem with interfaces is oftentimes people do not spend, they spend a whole bunch of time right here focused on what to do with the interface, and not a lot of time here, right? This is where interfaces, I think, get really hard, is figuring out what is the structure that needs to be here. I love it, absolutely love it, when I hear people in interviews start talking about like the interface segregation principle. Right? Because a couple of things that people get wrong on interfaces a lot is they go, well, I need a new method for my web service. Let's just tack that in, right? And Copilot's being a great example. Two methods, one's get data async, one's get JSON async. This is horrible, absolutely horrible, right? What do each of these methods do? Why do they do that? Like how they're named and the signature of them, I think is hard to do well. And when, more importantly, when, should this be, oh, get XML. Oh, Copilot, you're just going to self-destruct. I can see it now. I love it. Should these be separate interfaces, right? And being able to separate what bit of functionality should go in interface A, what bit of functionality should go in interface B, because my web service, like we could have a public interface JSON web service, right? That maybe has some bit of different logic, and we start separating these things up, and there's nothing stopping me from doing this, right? And saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. Implement interface, right? Implement interface, right? So I could do it this way, but I could also do it this way, right? And this is where I don't see people spending a lot of time. They just do whichever thing works. And functionally, you'll note, nothing changes about my web service in this case, right? They're identical. The amount of, the difference between me putting it here and me putting it here doesn't make a lick of difference for this class, right? And might not make a lick of difference in main window view model. Because I might come through here and I might go ahead and do JSON web service, right? Boom, right? I might do this. And where I put this interface, whether it's a base of web service or similar, changes a little bit, whether I might take in one parameter or two. But there's the fact that there's a single implementer of both of these interfaces. The code inside of here remains the same. Your DI setup may be a little different, but this is where things start to get really interesting. And oftentimes I feel like people do not focus enough time here and spend all of their time focused on where the interface is used and not designing the interface well. They are really hard to get right and do well. Okay. That was a complete tangent. Mountain Dew. So, pro tip, if you're interviewing with me and I start asking you about the when and why of interfaces, I would love to hear something about the interface segregation principle. I would love to hear something about focusing on the signature and API of an interface and designing it bonus points if you use the phrase leaky abstraction. That's oftentimes when, for example, you'll note the return type here is string, but get XML async. Right? There's a question about when the implementation starts to leak up into your interface, whether that be with a type or sometimes even just based upon the name. That can be bad, and it's not limited to here. For example, this is iWeb service, and this is iJSON web service. If my method's really going to be, get JSON, and that's kind of vague, but maybe it's like get config, is web relevant, right? Is it important that it comes from web, or is it just important that it provides JSON? Things like that, those little naming things, they start to make the life both interesting and complicated, and I love it. Mwah. Love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. So, interfaces, deceptively difficult, yada, 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 yada. Okay, I'm going to go and whack that off the constructor because that's just going to make my life a little more challenging. But the other thing I wanted to point out is, what if we don't want to use an interface? And maybe we don't have an interface. For example, Entity Framework is a great example here. It's quite common if you have, and I'm gonna fake Entity Framework here real quick. How about my DB context, right? So pretend this is a real EF context, right? So, all the usual stuff you see in here, right? Your DB sets, maybe some options, a model creating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite common to say, well, you know what? This class is going to take in an instance of my DB context, right? And perhaps, and again, I'm picking on EF here, and this is potentially not the right place to do it. But there are times where it doesn't make sense to use an interface, and instead, you should have a concrete class, right? And so we're going to do, public void save changes. Again, I'm making this look real-ish, right? And so let's imagine here that we also create an assigned field context. Great, sounds good. Add null check. Let's imagine that as part of our get data async, after we've gotten the data, do stuff with data, and then we're going to do context save changes. Right, and actually we can go even crazier. Do changes async. Oh, are you gonna be smart and know that I did do the return type correctly? Probably not. No, you're not that smart. Okay. Return task, completed task. Right. Okay, so we're gonna go there. So the thing here is, we may want to validate. Let's see. This is validating retrieves data. And I'm going to once again just go mock of. And this is another thing that I think people often don't realize that they have at their disposal, is mock of. I just need a mock of this type. I don't care about doing setups. I just need to shove something in. Because you know what? For this particular test, I'm focused on retrieving data. I am not focused on doing anything else. Right? So we're gonna grab this guy real quick, bring it down here, keep going, right? On command executes persists data. Now I'm doing these as two separate tests. Quite often when writing these tests, there's a general consensus that you should, one, ideally, if your methods are only doing one thing and they're not doing too much work, this gets easy. It gets hard if your methods are doing too much work. Is your test should test one thing at a time. And again, I'm putting air quotes around one thing because I usually tell people one logical thing. What is the logical thing here, right? If you've got a command that's like retrieve data, well, adding one more assert to make sure that you've appropriately saved the data is potentially perfectly fine inside of a test. But tests should generally focus on asserting on one condition. And this is oftentimes where I will focus in on the name of somebody's test. Because if you've named your test well, the name of your test drives what that one condition is that you're testing, and therefore your content should follow. So if you find yourself starting to use the words and or in your test name, that's usually an indication you should probably knock it off and not do that. So we're going to actually drive this point home. We're going to go Moq on this side and get an iWeb service. And again, this is going to end up giving me a, well, actually, yeah, you know what? In this case, I don't want to control that. Yep, we're not going to assert on any of this stuff. Right, and so here we are going to go Moq of my DB context, context Moq. And then we will come over here and do context mock.object. Right, and this is something that I think people oftentimes miss is you can mock a concrete type. Oh, look at that. Thank you, Copilot. You're very helpful today. I don't see my live unit testing, so I'm going to compile. Usually if I don't see my live unit testing running, it's because I have, Moq of my DB context. Usually if you don't see your live unit testing running, it's because it failed to compile. Okay, perfect. So we can see this test has failed, right? And we'll actually go and look at our test window to see. Expand all, please. I don't want to think too hard. So we can see here, this guy is now throwing an exception coming out of Moq saying, hang on, this is an unsupported expression. You know, x lambda x dot save changes async, non-overridable members. My DB context save changes may not be used in setup or verification expressions. And this is something that's very important to note. With Moq, whenever you're doing a lambda, whether that's a setup or a verify, if you look at the signature here, let's see if I can grab it. Oh, I did. You'll note the parameter type is of type expression. It's not of type func or delegate. That means this lambda is evaluated, not executed. Right? So if I put my cursor here and press F9, and if I debug this test, what you will see, well, that didn't help. It moved my breakpoint outside of it. Dang it. I was hoping to make a point. The debugger's too smart for me. Is it will not actually execute this code inside of here at all. That is not a thing that is going to occur. So that is important because when Moq takes in this expression, it has to figure out how it's going to generate its class. Right? And in this case, Moq is trying to generate a derived class from my DB context. But my DB context only has save changes async. Now, the quick and dirty approach here is you just make it virtual. Right? Because once it's virtual, you could imagine in your test project, you could make your testable my DB context, and now you can override save changes, and you can do like an increment or count and this, that, and the other, and you're off to the races. And you see, now we're running. You'll note these little circles here are not tied to live unit testing. They're tied to the regular test runner. So you can see that they are completely out of sync. But our test is now passing. And we can see that that is now properly working. And you'll note when we look at this guy, live unit testing, these little blue lines on the side here, these indicate that the line was not executed during any unit test. So when I am looking for things to see if I've actually covered my code properly, with live unit testing turned on, I'm looking for blue lines. Because I'm looking for, if it wasn't executed as part of the test run, I guarantee it's not tested. If it was executed, I can't guarantee it's tested, but I can guarantee it was run. Those are not always the same thing, right? People often use code coverage to indicate whether something's tested or not. No. You can't do that. Code coverage indicates whether it was executed, not whether it's tested. The is it tested requires actually looking at the test to see, does the test actually assert on something valid or not? So don't get those two things confused. And this guy should probably be awaiting it. Boom, something like that. So you can see this guy here never actually gets invoked. which is fine, right? That's sort of what we expect. We sort of anticipated that when we did this mock, that by default, it's going to go ahead and override the virtual members, which in this case is the save changes async, and it's going to give us that option. But be aware, if you run into this error, which I just had somebody messaged me about earlier today, they were trying to use a mock of a strongly typed object and didn't quite understand how to deal with the fact that it was giving that expression error. Hey, Dead Breadcrumb, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are having fun testing. Have you ever done mutation testing? Never on a production application. I've played around with it in kind of some handful of projects. It's pretty cool. Especially for people who are interested in really trying to kind of suss out bugs, mutation testing is pretty cool. I will say, most projects I get called in to help on, the teams struggle just to have reasonable unit tests. And I think mutation testing is targeted at people who have unit tests and are wanting to make a little bit more certain that their code is bulletproof. And it works really well for that, or at least as I've seen. I feel like that's like it's step 2 or step 3, and a lot of people are still on step 1. A lot of people are still on step 1. Oftentimes when I come in, one of the things that I focus on is just getting people to write better tests. Yeah, we struggle to get to step 1. Don't feel bad. I think that's where a lot of people are at, is oftentimes nobody focuses on how to write tests or how to write better tests. And so people either have very few tests or they have very poor tests. Both are bad, right? Some people get twitchy because I will often come in and just start deleting unit tests, and people don't like that because they're like, why? And it's like, if your test isn't providing value, delete it. It sounds extreme, but seriously, it is costing you execution time and developer cycles on your pipeline at a minimum. For a test that's not providing value shouldn't live. It should be deleted. Did it once, CI project, and found that 50% of the code was pointless. Yeah, and those types of things are amazing, because right now I think most of the time when people are doing these types of testing, I think analyzers are the closest a lot of people get, or if they're running like some of the JetBrains tools like Writer, ReSharper, they're a little bit better at detecting like dead code or missed things. Because the C# analyzers, the moment you declare something public, it goes, well, you might use this in a library somewhere. It may be invoked by some system I'm not aware of. I'm going to assume it's used. Whereas the JetBrains products, I'm trying to remember what they call it. There's a setting where it's like pessimistic versus optimistic, and you can tell it, hey, this is an app. I'm never referencing it as a library. Don't make that assumption. Show me my dead stuff, right? And then you can start walking the thing and tree pruning. Yeah, 60% test coverage, super brittle and half broken. Yes, Dead Breadcrumb, don't feel bad. I think a lot of projects are right about at that point. Okay, but we've got this back. We've got this thing here. Now, I want to circle back to the thing that Benjamin asked a little bit earlier about if you had something that was potentially doing multiple calls. Like, let's say we're doing this. Data 1, data 2, data 1, it's data 2, right? We want to do something of this nature. This is now, see, look at that. Test fails. Mwah, love it, love it, love it, love it. Because right now, our test is failing because we are expecting that our data property is just going to be my result. And let's imagine we want it to be my result, and then I don't know, space, hello world, because that is useful, right? So we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and then we're going to come down here, and we're going to say expected data 1 plus expected data 2, boom. That's what we expect to get. Obviously, this is failing. If we look at the Did I close it again? I need to stop closing it. Live unit testing window. Boom. We look at our thing, we can see that right now it's just concatenating my result with my result. Kind of makes sense. We invoke the method twice, and each time it was told return my result, and it dutifully returned the same thing every time. But imagine you actually want to do something a little more interesting. So Victor hit it right on the head. Setup sequence is the magical incantation. Yeah, I'll circle back to that. So you'll note here we can do return async, and we haven't changed much between setup and setup async unless you look really closely at the return types between these two. You'll note setup sequence returns an I setup sequence result or I setup sequential result, right? Whereas if we just do setup, it returns an, oh, I missed it. I got it. Okay. Visual Studio, I would love it if there was a method to not gray out those things. Some point I'm going to poke around and find it. And the difference here, you'll note when I do a return async, even though these methods are named the same, they're returning very different types. And so your ability to chain them, even though the code you write looks similar, these are separate methods. They're named similarly to make this type of thing easy, but they are very different methods altogether. Okay, and you can see now we've gotten past our assert equals. So our data property is now properly expected data 1, expected data 2. And now where we're failing is on the verification of our service. Is we had told it, hey, we only expect get data async to be invoked once. Well, now that expectation has changed, right? So we can come in here and we can say, okay, we want it to be, at least once, at most once, between some number of calls. Honestly, these top ones, I don't use that much. Usually if I'm doing this type of setup, it's once, never, or exactly. Like these are your three big ones. Most of the time, like 99.9% of the time, I know exactly how many times I expect a method to be called. Based upon my setup or similar, there's not like outside stuff that I'm worried about. I know exactly what it's supposed to be. But that does lead into a good point. There are times it is better to not use a mock. It is oftentimes, if you can get away with it, do not use a mock. Okay? I'll say that again. If you can get away with it, do not use a mock. Use the real thing. Right? Sometimes I see people putting in interfaces because they want to test things in isolation. But some of the stuff that they mock end up being things that they're methods that don't necessarily have adverse side effects, or it's kind of the logic that you want to test. So the problem with mocks and interfaces in general is they're seams in your code, right? They're places where the joints fit together. You imagine, I'll call myself an amateur plumber, right? If you've got a pipe with a bunch of fittings putting together, where is the pipe going to leak? Right at the fitting, right? Right where the two things come together. And in code, people put interfaces all over, and it's like having a bunch of small sections of pipe with a ton of little fittings all over the place. And even people who have great test coverage, every place where there's one of those fittings, that's where the bugs come in. Because this test is only as good as me making this mock behave like the real service. The moment this mock doesn't behave like the real service, all bets are off, and this test may be worthless. Because it's very easy with mocks to test conditions that are not reachable otherwise. Right? It is possible with mocks to test conditions that are not reachable otherwise, because the real implementation would prevent it. And because you're testing an implementation that doesn't exist, does that actually matter, right? Now, some people might go, well, somebody might create a second implementation of the interface and register that in DI, and so I'm testing behavior that might exist, right? Sure, fine, maybe. But you're putting a bunch of seams in, and the point of these tests is to guarantee, to build confidence that your code is correct. Right? The point of these tests is to build confidence that your code is correct. An interface describes the edge of a jigsaw piece. Yeah, like how things fit together. But it is much easier to put together a 2-piece puzzle than a 10-piece puzzle. Right? I can guarantee if I've only got 2 pieces of the puzzle, it's going to be much easier to make everything line up and go together nicely. I like the puzzle example. I may have to steal that, Izzy. So, if possible, use a real implementation. Like I see people do this with like hashing and encryption code. Is they wrap it up and put it somewhere else behind an interface so they can test it. And then they have to mock away that interface, and they've got like a base 64 function that they've hidden behind an interface, and their test method returns a string that's not base 64 encoded. It's like, well, yeah, and then their code works, and then at runtime there's a bug. It's like, well, yeah, you weren't returning real data because now you've got a disjoint between those two things. Don't do that. Don't do that. Use the real thing. There was no issue using the real thing. Just when possible, use it. Let's see. What if the web service you want the return of the output of multiple methods, get data, get XML, etc. Yeah. So if it was actually concatenating multiple different methods, this would just end up being multiple setups, right? So setup, get data, async, right? I'm somewhat tempted to leave this for the moment. Let's make a second method real quick. I'm just going to go public async task get data to async. Don't do this. This is bad implementation, right? But we're gonna do it anyway. Wow. I mean, that's not bad, but no. Get XML async. All right, so something to that effect. And then we're going to go here because this gets me most of what I want. We'll go here, get data to, and we're no longer going through the commands. So we're going to do that. And we're going to go get data to async. Yeah, in case you didn't catch it, I subtly switched. Oh, and I'm doing this bad. Well, we'll come back to that in a minute. I just noticed that I wasn't doing an async test. So I should do that. But what this ends up being is just being setup get data, and then this ends up being a second setup here, get XML async, and it goes like this. And I think that goes here. This then ends up being ×1, and this becomes get XML async times exactly 1. Something of that nature. Now, I have done a ridiculous amount of assertions here. There is a concept of not asserting on things. Oftentimes, because people will write their tests quite commonly after they've written their code, right? Where I work, we don't necessarily care whether people do test-driven development or not. But at pull request time, we expect to see tested code. The idea with test-driven development, and one of its benefits, is it forces you to almost think about your assertions before writing the code. And if you write the code first, oftentimes people's assertions basically come down to, hey, I looked at this method, well, I can see what it's doing, therefore I assert on what it's doing. Some people will refer to this as like a pinning unit test. It's pinning the functionality to exactly that. A much better approach is to think about, what am I testing and why? And saying, okay, I want to test get to data async. What is important about this method? Is it important that it calls context save changes? Is that important, or is that an implementation detail? Right? Is that important, or is that an implementation detail? Because ideally, you want to assert that it behaves the way you want, not that it invokes the methods you expect. Now, those things are often similar, but not always the same, right? So, and this is where naming of it really goes a long way of thinking about, what is important for me to actually test here. Is it important that it does this? And oftentimes the easiest thing is, would I want this test to fail if this were gone, right? Andrew, people write code first to make Copilot write unit tests for them. Guilty as charged. Yes, absolutely, 100%. Also, I need to recant something I think I said on stream a while back. I don't know if it's going to show. I don't know if it's going to show my history in here or not. I should be a little careful. Previously, I had told people Copilot chat was the next best thing to worthless. It has gotten significantly better. Significantly better. I banged my head against a wall dealing with an open API spec that I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. Spent an hour trying to track it down. Finally got annoyed, copied, pasted it into Copilot chat and said, what's wrong with this? And it spit out the answer exactly on the mark. And I went, dang nabbit. Dang nabbit. So I have reinstalled it, and I'm giving it a second chance because it earned itself a second try on that one, because I spent an hour not thinking about, I'll just ask the magical AI to tell me what's wrong with my code, and it immediately spotted the issue. I'm like, dang it, stupid automated rubber ducks. Yeah, so let's see. Victor, on the subject of what and why with mocks, could you touch on being careful that you're testing the behavior of the unit rather than the setup? Yes, that is a very good call out. So oftentimes, and some people will refer to this as mocking away the assertions, because it is very easy to accidentally walk yourself into a situation where, in this case, we let's see. So in this case, we're going through sut.data. Trying to think of what's a quick way to go through and do this. But the idea being that you end up asserting that your setups are set up properly, which doesn't make sense, right? Another way that it comes in is sometimes people will like to try to throw like an assert up here, like I want to, and this is probably a good example up here, right? It is not uncommon for me to see somebody do something like this: assert equal, right, 1, or actually let's do this, 0 sut.count, right? It is not uncommon for me to see somebody want to write a test like this, where they're like, I'm testing the increment. I want to make sure it increments by 1. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to assert that my count starts at 0, invoke the command, and then I want the count to be 1. Right? And there's nothing inherently wrong about this per se. Like it's good-ish, but this isn't quite like this. Once you start seeing asserts outside of the assert portion of your test, it raises a red flag and starts to cause me to question the test and look a little closer. So there are ways around this. One, you'll note that the test before, I just straight up set the count, right? If you find that you need to do asserts inside of the arrange portion of one of your tests, that sounds like a separate test that needs to be written, right? If it is important to you that the default state of count is 0, right? That's a test. That is a bit of behavior about this view model that you've identified, that it is important that when this launches, the initial state is 0, right? Maybe you're going to open a dialog or similar, right? It's not uncommon to say, hey, I expect that the initial state of my thingy is X. Great. Have a test that makes sure that the initial state of count is 0. And then get rid of every assert in any other test that's asserting in the arrange portion. You've already covered it in a different test, right? The rest of your test can now be fat, dumb, and happy and go, you know what? We're going to make that, we're going to go through and make that assumption because we've got a test covering it. Let's see. That is essentially a pinning test then, right? Yeah, ish. A couple things I will show. It is, so two ways to deal with this kind of precondition case. Option one, int before count, right? This is one way to write this test, right? It's subtle. It's very subtle. But I've now guaranteed that I've gone up by 1, right? I could also do this, right? Thank you. I like how XUnits analyzers are smart enough to catch when I've been stupid. I could do this. Literally just move the assert down, right? Capture the before content, the state of it beforehand, do the act, and then assert afterwards, right? It is a subtle change. All of these, I would argue, are possible. Which is correct is very much going to depend on what you are testing, though, and what is important. Is it important that the increment count command started at 0? Is that important? Or is it only important that the count is incremented by 1? Right? Because all of these are good ways of testing this. But the question is, what is the best way to test this, and what is the behavior that matters? I think this is potentially the best. That I don't care where it started. I just care how it goes for 1. Let's see. I like how Moq has setup and verify on the Moq. Previously used end substitute, and when doing setup and verify, you end up having to use programs to shut up the code analyzers. Yes. And I won't say that it's perfect. You do get yourself into a bit of situation where you kind of end up duplicating yourself a little bit. For example, it is very common to have your setup, and actually I'm glad you asked this, Izzy. This is a good thing to show off. It is very common to have the lambda in your setup basically match the lambda in your verify. Like quite often, they're identical. And this gets a little worse too, because if these methods start taking parameters, you have to actually fill those in, right? And we'll get to that in a second. So there is a shorthand here where you can do something like verifiable, right? And this is a very useful thing to use because quite often you don't necessarily care about the number of times something was invoked. You just want to verify that your setup was actually done. Because like in the mutation test where things aren't done, I see people who do all kinds of setups quite often, and I'm guilty of this too, because you watched me do it earlier, because you've copied and pasted the test from just above, and then you've forgotten to delete something that you don't need for this test, and now you've got extra stuff in here that's just worthless and not doing anything, right? So a common idea here is you mark the setup is verifiable, and then you come down here and you can do mock web service dot verify, right? And this guy goes through and jump to it, right? Verifies that all verifiable expectations have been met. So it just goes through and says, hey, everything that you flagged is verifiable. I'm going to go through and just make sure that that was invoked at least once, because that's a fairly common thing to do. That way you don't have to write all of these verifies. You can just say, yeah, I just want to make sure that it's done. And sometimes if you get real lazy, real lazy, you can just do this, right? Verifies all expectations regardless of whether they've been flagged as verifiable or not, right? I actually was talking with a colleague a while back, and I posited the idea that verify all might be the most overused, horrible thing that people can implement. Because like verify all is great. This is great shorthand syntax. I didn't have to do dot verifiable. I got the same behavior as dot verify and a lot less typing. Great. The problem is verify all verifies all setups were matched. And there it is not uncommon to have some setups that are directly related to your tests and a few setups that are maybe aren't related to your test. For example, you have a dependency and maybe something is used in the constructor, but then also something else is now used in the method that you're testing. Well, you have to do the setup for the thing in the constructor, but the only thing you actually care about is the thing that's being done in the method that you're testing. So verify all, totally feel free to use it, but again, it comes with a cost. So be aware of that. Only verify all if legitimately you want to verify all, right? If everything that you're setting up on is directly in the path of the unit that you're testing, because again, unit test is test a single unit. That doesn't necessarily mean single method, though often it does. A single logical unit. Like with all of this testing stuff, I think logical unit's the best way I can phrase it. Is as long as things are logically one thing, I don't care how many methods there are, right? At a certain point, it gets really hard to justify that these 10 methods are one logical unit, but depends, right? It's hard to say without seeing examples. Okay. There is, I think, the importance of Moq in a nutshell. Setup sequence, returns. Oh, one other key method I'm going to point out. Let's imagine, like, right now we are doing some assertions on the data expectation. Let's imagine that we actually care about the order of these invocations. Like perhaps the order matters, right? Maybe we're invoking a web service to some third party, and we want to make sure that there's a start operation and a stop operation, right? But we want to make sure that start comes first, right? That maybe like just verifying that both calls were done doesn't guarantee the order of the calls. Now, Moq doesn't necessarily give you an easy way to do this. However, there's an escape hatch where you can do whatever you want, right? So on all of your mocks, there is a callback guy in here. Now, the thing I will point out, this is one of the few methods inside of the Moq library that is in fact a delegate, right? Not an expression. And the key thing here with a delegate, you can do curly braces, right? Expressions basically have to be one-liner. They're expressions. But delegates, you can put whatever you want. You can invoke another method if you want. Have at it. The only thing that matters here is the signature of your callback needs to be matching what this is, right? In this case, no parameters, no parameters. If this, took a string, I might do, string boo, right? Something to that effect, right? So the signature needs to match. I believe you also can work if it takes a parameter, I think it'll also happily take empty and just know that means drop. But I think your choice is either match all or none. But inside of this callback here, right, we can do something like bool get XML called, right? And so we can do something like get XML called gets true, right? This is functionally now getting us down to a single invocation because we can't be called twice, right? But we can also do something like, get JSON called, right? And now down in here, we can do something a little more to this. Get JSON called. We can do something similar. Hey, Copilot, write the rest of this implementation for me. Come on, Copilot. Nothing? You're not going to do it for me? Here, let me help you. Assert true, get XML called. Do the rest. Thank you. Thank you. You've been wonderful. So now we can actually go through and start asserting and say, oh, okay, well, get XML should be called first. Therefore, this assert is failing, and you can see we're blowing up right on this line, right? So now if we come over here and we go, well, okay. In this case, I'm positing that get XML is like start, the other one stop. And now we are actually asserting on the order of the call. So if you need to do anything fancy at all, the callback is more or less Moq's escape hatch for Yeah, we didn't cover that. Do what you need. Um, oh yeah, so showing the package reference for the Moq library, do the GitHub sponsor thing. Yeah. So what Izzy is referencing is there was a version of the Moq library that went out a few months ago, that contained what many people considered malware, or at least deceptive practices of potentially capturing user information. That change has since been reverted. There's actually even a flag on NuGet.org marking it as a vulnerable package to strongly hint to people to update it. The current, oh, that didn't show my version. I'm using centralized package management. So the Moq version that I'm on, 42069, which I don't know if that's a joke, because right after the whole Moq fiasco, the author released multiple updates fairly rapidly, and he changed his version numbering scheme at the same time. I don't really know why, but we can go ahead and grab this. Yeah, I believe 69 and later is all safe. Don't quote me on that. Always do your due diligence and double check, but I believe 69 and later is good. That's just what I've plugged into my .NET templates, and I should probably release an update. Yeah, so I believe if we go back, because the Moq library is straight up open source, so if anybody's ever questioning what is actually in here, yeah, so you can see, especially after that fiasco happened, like, one, I feel a little bad for the author, because the open source community just, like, he got reamed hard. But it also meant that people are paying real close attention. And so there's been a lot of changes that have gone in recently. Let me look at, because I think the release notes on... Yeah. So you'll note specifically the thing that people were unhappy about was the sponsor link stuff inside, because that's what was capturing user information, prompting for sponsorship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, yeah, so there is all of that stuff. So 42069 is where it got stripped out. If anybody doesn't believe him, like, you can check the actual commits to see the changes in the diffs that have gone in there, and all of these things through here. And there's been a lot of people looking into it. So if anybody is questioning it, I mean, the other thing as well, it's potentially worth noting, like, in a lot of cases, people really should be locking down their build agents, because if your build agent is vulnerable to a single package making an external call outbound and exfilling data, that means you're vulnerable to a supply chain attack very easily, right? Like, this one was benign. He was not a, like, I don't believe there was any intent of, I don't believe there was malicious intent with what he did. I believe it was all around saying, this project's unmaintainable, I need support, this is my way of trying to encourage people to support the project, right? I think it was done all in good faith from what I could tell. I think the implementation was poor, but I think what was done wasn't intended to be malicious. The thing is, though, if that is what scares people, how closely do you validate all your other open source packages, right? Because if that made it in and your security didn't block it, there's potentially a problem there. So yeah, so things of that nature. Okay, let's do AutoMocker. Okay, this one excites me. Okay, first of all, I got to show something off. One, I have been annoyed for quite some time that when you go here, we do not have an icon. This bothers me. Our package has 12 million bloody downloads and we don't even have an icon. That's very sad. There is an open pull request now. with an icon, and I am now happy. Uh, I will point out I am not a UI designer, so take it with a grain of salt. I blatantly poached the actual Moq icon and tweaked it. I think you can probably guess what the tweaks are, and made a pretty icon. So because frankly, this is a pretty low bar to beat. This is a pretty low bar to beat. So makes me want a coffee. You know what? I'm going to take that as a compliment, and I think that's success because anything that induces caffeine intake is probably good. So there is hopefully an icon coming there. So I'm going to show you guys what is current prod on AutoMocker, and then I'm going to show you some of the preview stuff that's coming in next release, because this is where things start to get real fun. So most people are familiar with Moq. Moq has significantly more downloads than AutoMocker. There's other libraries that plug in with Moq to give you similar functionality. Let me show you what AutoMocker does, and then I will show you a few of the small things that differentiate it, along with some of the upcoming coolness. Okay, so step one, right? Let's take our first test, and I'm gonna put a AM on the end of it for AutoMocker, just so it executes. This here, this is one of the things that AutoMocker is designed to solve. Is constructors are like static methods, or Mountain Dew. Yes, Izzy, exactly. Speaking of which, first one down. You won't be able to see it due to the green screen, but I promise there's a second one in queue. Constructors are basically static methods, right? Their job in life is to take in an instance of an object and initialize up all its variables. That's what they do. But they are not virtual. They are not overridable. You cannot do that. And that means that wherever you invoke a static method, there's some coupling there, some tight coupling. And with dependency injection, people try to break away so that they aren't using the new keyword very much, right? Because the moment you call new on something, you're tightly coupling the thing that's calling new with the thing that it instantiated, right? Though there's now a tight coupling there. Is that bad? That depends, right? But ideally, if we don't have to do that, and we can leverage our DI container and do some sort of fancy injection, that's better. Now, the problem being is for testing, we don't really want to just instantiate up a DI container, because there's nothing stopping you inside of these tests from doing something like service, collection, collection, right? And then we can go through and do, collection, add singleton. Like, there's nothing stopping us from doing this, right? Oh, go Copilot, go, right? And then you could do, main window view model VM gets provider dot get required service, right, of main window view model. Like, nothing is stopping you from doing this whole thing, right? If you're not using the Microsoft DI container, insert DI container of choice, right? This is a thing you could do. This is very heavy-handed, and unless you're trying to test your DI configuration, which I think everyone should, to make sure that you've appropriately registered everything, this doesn't do you. This is kind of painful, and more often than not, like, we're adding singletons in here, but I don't want. In some cases, I might want the real implementation. In a lot of cases, I probably just want to put a mock in instead, right? So rather than doing this maneuver, what I might want to do is something more like this, right? Where I start injecting all of this stuff and building it out. But like the service collection class, you have to register all the things. Like the Microsoft DI container doesn't have some of the features that other DI containers have, where it like scans the assembly and does some auto registering and all that jazz. No. You tell it exactly what you want, and it goes, got it. This and only this is what I know about. I will build the things, right? That's it. Like, it's fast and efficient, and it only does exactly what you've told it and no more, right? That's why some people like other DI libraries, because they come with more features and you can do other stuff, right? So if you care about those features, find a third-party library that has the feature you care about and use it. Okay, what AutoMocker does is effectively this with a lot less work, right? So, for example, AutoMocker, mocker gets new. I'm just going to kill all this off. Right? And then rather than, and this line here is the problematic line because this is the static. If we were to go and add another constructor parameter, we would have to go through every single one of these tests and fix them to add in that new parameter. That is a pain in the butt, especially since just because I add a new parameter, it might be for a different method. It might not be related to the increment count command at all. Why am I touching this test? Right? This test should only need to change if something around the increment count command needs to change. Right? So what AutoMocker does, I have a library that adds scanning and registers forwarding factories for Microsoft DI. Yeah. Something you wrote yourself, Izzy, or something, or a third-party one that you pulled in? Because I think I've seen a lot of people do very similar because it's a common thing that everyone wants. And look at that. It works. It just works. Okay? So, AutoMocker is more or less a fancy dictionary around a bunch of mock objects. To some degree, you can think of it as a lightweight DI container, not unlike a service provider. In fact, service provider, P gets Mocker. Mocker actually implements service provider if you want it. You don't have to use it, right? And I will caution people, this has actually been a source of many bugs for us, is because we implemented service provider, which service provider is a very simple interface. It has get service. That's it. I wrote it back in Netcore 1.1 days. Oh, cool. iService provider is very simple. It just retrieves a service. Okay? AutoMocker implements it. It does not behave like the service provider class. So, for example, people have complained that we don't have the equivalent of like add scoped, right? Because AutoMocker, again, is more or less a dictionary, and we functionally, things are singleton. Like everything in AutoMocker is singleton. I'm going to put a little asterisk because that's a lie. But functionally, if you just think of everything inside your AutoMocker instance as a singleton, that's it, right? So, first feature, decouples from your constructor so you no longer have to do all that garbage. Okay, let's do the next one, right? One other thing I'm going to call out. I see a lot of people, they really like to take their arrange portion of their test and move it into a common setup. That is mostly fine, with a few caveats that I will call out. One, avoid statics, because I've seen people put their mocks in like static fields. That's a great way to shoot yourself in the foot. Don't do that. It's okay to new up new instances, right? Some people I've seen, they store a static field and in their setup, they do like a reset on the mock. Stop it, right? Like, are you trying to, like, unless you've got something that shows that you need to save that little bit of memory allocation and therefore that's why you're doing that, no, just new, done, right? New instance per test. It will save you a new instance per test will save you a lot of headaches. Because statics, things tend to get leaked, especially people turn on executing stuff in parallel. Yeah, like too many people rely on the fact that each thing is going to be separate and they're going to run sequentially. Don't do that. So in general, I don't mind seeing people putting like setup stuff like this in their setup, but like don't share instances. And anything you put in the setup for your class, make sure it actually applies to every test in the class. If it doesn't apply to every test and only applies to most of them, just make a method, right? Private void my setup that only applies sometimes, right? Done. Like, and then just invoke this in all the places. Like, aggressively refactor your test, but don't do bad things. Because it's just as bad to have your setup allocate and set up a whole bunch of stuff and then not use it in a test. So if it's not going to be used in a test, knock it off. That's also another place where verify all bites people left and right, is they put a verify all and then they do setups in a common method and then realize, oh shoot, that didn't work because I needed a setup there, but I only needed it for this test, but not this other one. Yeah, just don't do that. Just separate them. It's not that bad. Okay, so let's look at this one, right? So you'll note very quickly that my default setting for no Copilot, all my tests is more or less, the first line is instantiate new AutoMocker instance. That's basically it. Dang, Copilot. Yeah, that's pretty close. So you'll note here, AutoMocker has a method on it for get Moq. Right? There's a couple other methods that are worth calling out. Get as well will just retrieve an instance. You can think of this as more or less akin to the mock of type situation. What the big difference between AutoMocker and like a regular DI container, AutoMocker, if you ask it for something and it doesn't already have something stored for it, it's going to try to create you a mock and give you that back instead. So it's kind of like a DI container with a fallback that says, yeah, just mock it, just mock it, just mock it, right? It has some built-in behavior for things like lazy, func, action, a bunch of those commonish things. But by default, if it gets all the way through its list of things that it's going to try, one of the last ones on the list is, yeah, just shell out to mock. And use that instance. So if you call get, you're going to get an instance. It should be non-null in most cases. We'll get into resolvers in a moment. But the idea being that it makes it is an easy way to do it. So quite often, if you are looking to go between old mock and new one, you will note that this setup sequence here with these returns async are basically identical. There's one key difference here in the fact that this one had mock behavior of strict. And if you just call get mock, it is not going to give you a strict mock, right? You get only one. The other thing that it does give you is AutoMocker will go after private constructors for things if you tell it to, right? There is a Boolean flag to say enable private, to say, hey, when you're using reflection to look at this type, yeah, include the private constructors as well, because we'll actually leverage those to go in and get them. So it tries to give you those extra things. Now, if you want a strict mock, there are a couple ways to go about getting it. One, the AutoMocker instance itself does take in a mock behavior, and the mock behavior will get used anytime it falls back to mock and says, create me a new mock. Is it will grab that behavior and go, I'm making a new mock. My default behavior is great, strict. Now, that may be overkill because maybe you don't want all your mocks being strict. Because if I were to turn this on, you'll note here we have one strict mock and one loose mock. And so there's not a good way for me to specify either here or here. The other thing that you can do is you can just go mocker use, and you can go ahead and send it a new mock of iWeb service, and you can certainly do mock behavior.strict, right? We can just tell it, hey, by the way, use this mock instance, right? And you're off to the races, right? And you'll note there's multiple use overloads, but there's very specifically a use overload for mock. Right, so if you feed it in a mock, it's going to register up on the mock service type, not on the type of mock. Just for reference, so it queues it up here, and then when you call down here, when we do mocker, when you spell it correctly, that's important. When you do mocker create instance, main window view model, boom, 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 right? All AutoMocker is going to do is leverage the mock that is stored inside of it to be able to pull this back. Now this is obviously failing because this is no longer useful. And if we want to do this, we can go Mocker, and then Moq. Even so, you have two choices with AutoMocker. Is there are convenience methods on AutoMocker directly for things like setup, verify, etc. If you don't want to use the convenience method, you can always just get the Moq back out and then do just normal Mocky things on it, right? You don't have to use the convenience methods. However, the convenience methods do make it really easy because now I can do that. And I can say, hey, Mocker verify, and it knows when I call Mocker verify, okay, reach inside, find the Moq of iWeb service. Here's the expression that I want you to pass to the verify method on that Moq. Go ahead and do it for me, right? And then the most OP broken thing from before, right? Mocker verify all. Again, be real cautious with this. If you call verify all, make absolutely certain that you actually want to verify all on all the setups. Right? I think this method gets overused a lot in places where people over assert in their test rather than thinking about what is the behavior I care about. So if in fact you really do want to verify on all your setups, great, fine. It's a great convenience. But the important thing with Mocker is when you call things like verify all, it's going to iterate through every Moq that it knows about and go through and do it because it's keeping track of all of those things. If you look at Mocker resolved objects, you will see this guy here, oh, I got it, is a dictionary of type object. This is everything Moq knows about and is tracking. So either objects will make it into this dictionary because they were dependencies of something it was instantiating, right? So calls to main window view model will instantiate it. Or if you do a call to use, that just manually puts something into that dictionary, right? So when you ask AutoMocker for something, one of the things it will do is, do I already have one of those things in my dictionary? Oh, I do. Let's just use that. Which is why I say functionally, if you think about AutoMocker as just a dictionary of things, conceptually, you're going to be right more often than not. That's typically the way it's resolving. I'm hedging there because there's an extension point that I want to show off. So going through and doing this, you can always do get Moq. I think we can also go here and just say, you know what? Rather than pulling the Moq out, I'm just going to do setup sequence. You'll note whenever you use the convenience Mocker, the convenience method directly on Mocker, you do end up having to specify generics on it because AutoMocker can't infer from just the lambda what Moq type because it's tracking a whole dictionary thing. So you kind of have to give it the generic parameters so that it actually knows what thing we're actually talking about. And again, you can either do it like this or you can just pull the Moq out and act on the Moq directly. If we mock a thing that has dependencies, are those also mocked? And can I pull those out for assertions in my test? So the answer is probably and yes. So if there are dependencies, so specifically create instance is recursive, right? So it will look at create instance will look at your constructors, order them by the number, whichever ones have the most parameters, and operate in reverse order there. And then as long as it can find one where it can resolve all of the types, it will use it. Anything that it resolves, it will cache in its dictionary. So it will pull those things in and hold on to them in the dictionary for use later. Anything in that dictionary you can pull back out. So either with a mocker.get or a mocker.getMoq. GetMoq will fail if you try to pull out a thing that isn't in fact a Moq. So if something injected something that wasn't a Moq, and then you try to pull it out as a Moq, it'll go, no, it's not a Moq. Bad. Yeah, testing A, but assert that it called B, which I didn't set up. So if you don't do a setup, there is nothing stopping you from doing, like, for example, this guy has two dependencies in here. So it's going to mock out iWeb service and my DB context. Technically, the mocking of the web service is it's going to use this instance here, but there will be 2 items in the dictionary at the very end. In fact, we can just do this real quick. And so if you wanted to do an assertion on the DB context, we go here and we look at the resolved objects. Oh, I missed it. Okay, we're just going to go to the watch window because, frankly, this is getting annoying. Mocker dot, yeah, that'll work fine. Shut up. Boom, boom, boom. All right, so we can see the 2 items that are in there, and they are both mocks. So I do have a mock of my DB context. So if I wanted to, I could certainly come down here and do mocker get mock, pull out my DB context, and go through here. It will attempt, if it's so this is one of those areas where AutoMocker will try to do its best, but it can't always tell the difference between whether you want recursive create instance behavior or whether you want it to mock a concrete type. So occasionally you do have to intentionally shove in an instance because it doesn't know what behavior you are intending for. So create instance is recursive. It will shove things into that dictionary that it uses to resolve those, and you can pull any of them out afterwards. So yes, the dependencies are probably mocked. Again, if it's a dependency of like lazy of t, you're not going to get mock of lazy of t. AutoMocker is going to see the lazy of t, and I'll show you how it handles that in a moment. But it'll actually put a lazy instance in. Let's see. Type should not be examined on system type instances. Yes, I assume you're talking about for type matching or similar. Correct. Like this resolved objects, this is largely there for debugging purposes and as an escape hatch when somebody needs to do something that we didn't think of. Yeah, type of type get type. Yeah, don't do that because that now you've gotten yourself into a weird situation. That's largely what these resolved objects are here for, and quite often for debugging, it's quite useful to be able to see, hey, what are the things that it knows about? Why did it plug that thing in? For like mock objects in the debugger, you can then dive in and start looking at, in case people haven't seen this before, like for example, what did we call here? Get data command, right? So I can come into web service. I can get into the mock instance. On the mock instance itself, you can actually like start diving into the invocations and you can see which calls were actually made on your mock. Now, it requires kind of digging through the expressions and the storage of it, but having these things available and shown is part of the motivation for why they're there. If you find yourself having to go to that dictionary a lot for something, please open a feature request or something on the AutoMocker library, because for a while it was internal, but we made it public because there was a handful of people that want to do some wacky stuff, which is fine. But ideally, if you've got a valid use case, we might want to handle it a different way than going directly at it. Yeah, I've been trying to use Moq for a while now. Yeah, and Moq itself is good. It just doesn't give all this extra fun. This, in my opinion, adds the stuff that makes the testing a lot easier. And a lot nicer to work with. Okay, the one other thing I want to call out is quite often people will ask for things where they're like, I want to do some custom behavior to create object of type foo, right? And I mentioned that my little asterisk of let's see, in the interest of readability should be simplified to that end. There are other ways in new link can be simplified. I agree with you, LSD. I might need some context into which of my statements that's referencing, though. If you make it easy, people will use it. That is the goal. That is the goal. And to, aside from not writing documentation for this library, I feel like we've done a good job. I will say this. The documentation for this library sucks. It's been on my backlog of things that I want to fix for a while, and with my plethora of free time, I've never gotten to it. So hopefully this video serves as some help to certain people for it. So inside of the Moqer instance, there is this concept of a resolver, right? And this is when AutoMocker goes to create a thing, what it does is it actually walks through this list of resolvers. And you'll note here, if we go back to our watch window, there are, by default, a bunch of resolvers plugged in. But there's nothing stopping you. This is just a list. You can add or remove things from this list and have fun, right? This is how you can start customizing AutoMocker and have it behave the way you want. So again, when you ask AutoMocker for a thing, the first thing it does, like if you do mocker.get and you ask it for a thing, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to use the cache resolver and say, okay, is it a thing in my cache? If it is, great, I'm going to use that, right? If it's not in the cache, it uses a self resolver. And this one here says resolve anything that asks for an AutoMocker instance. Like if you do AutoMocker get and you ask for AutoMocker, it returns itself back out. I know it sounds weird to do that, but there's a handful of cases in like DI container stuff where that's actually kind of helpful. So we plugged in a default resolver for it. There are arrays. If something is asking for an array of T, and AutoMocker knows how to do the T, it will populate the array for you. And so rather than getting a mock, you'll get an array that contains a thing that AutoMocker knows about. Great. That's kind of what you want. Or you'll get like array.empty. Great. Wonderful. We like having empty things drop in. If you're trying to test like maybe command line parsing, you're passing in string arrays, you probably want to inject it with an array filled with the strings you care about. But whatever, right? It's up to you. We're going to skip disposable. Enumerable basically works the same way as array, only on IEnumerable. Lazy and func. So for anybody who has watched my DI videos where I show off using like func and lazy as a lightweight factory for a DI container, AutoMocker will just handle those parameters for you. So if you have a view model that takes a func of, my dialog view model, for example, AutoMocker will see that and go, I got you. What you want me to inject is a func that calls back into me asking for my dialog view model. And so it'll build up a func or a similar lazy, right? Because lazy is just a wrapper around a func. So it'll build one of those up and inject those for you. If you have something that takes in a cancellation token, it will shove in a cancellation token for you. You'll get cancellation token none, but hey, it's at least something there. And then the very last thing is the thing that says, okay, I give up. I didn't find anything I wanted. Let's shell out to the mock resolver instead, right? And this is where it actually shells out and says, okay, in MOQ, give me a mock of this thing. And it's important to note, the mock of T has limitations on what it will let you mock. Right? Like if you try to feed it in a sealed class, it's going to yell at you and go, yeah, and it blows up. And AutoMocker can't fix that, right? Because at the end of the day, the mock resolver is shelling out to the mock library. And at that point, it's on the mock library to handle things. And things for Castle Dynamic Proxy are similar. Let's see. Can type of return the actual type instead of the current POV of that object? Not sure I understand. So if you're talking about going through like that dictionary where it's Moqer resolved objects, typically what I would find is if you're looking to pull something out like this and you're trying to say, well, okay, of type, I, web service, etc. Like if you find you're doing this, it's like, well, this isn't matching because the actual value is a mock of I web service and all of that stuff. In general, you are not expected to go to this dictionary directly, right? This dictionary is only exposed because people found it useful to be able to see it. and help diagnose it, it's not something you're typically expected to use. A much simpler option is just called Moq or get, right? Web service. That will deal with looking in the dictionary. If the stored thing is a real instance, it'll give that back. If it's a mock, it'll unwrap it. If I pass a to a function, in the function, if I do type of on the, is it the art type, not type of a. Oh, I got you. So there is, so I think, let me see if I'm actually following this correctly. I think it's, if you do something like mock of, right? There's a difference between T1 type of iWeb service and this, right? Yeah, but we'll show what the real type is. So I think this is kind of what you're driving at, of what the subtle difference is between the, oh, adding code in the middle of a debug session doesn't work well. Right, of what you end up seeing. So, for example, the locals. Why are my locals not open? What's that breakpoint section? Autos. That's not quite what I want. Okay. Locals. Give me my local window. Come on. Thank you. There we go. So, for example, T1, T2, right? So T1 is showing iWeb service versus T2, which is the actual underlying Castle dynamic proxy type. A similar thing will happen with Moq of being able to look at it is. So if you look at it in the debugger window, you will get the equivalent of foo get type, because you'll be looking at the runtime type of what it is. If you're using something like a type of is resolved at compile time, so it has to be a known type, right? So determining what you're going to go after. I think I got that right. Let me know if I missed the mark on that one, Izzy. I'm not sure I fully grokked the question. I think I'm close, but let me know if I'm not. Okay, so the other thing that this enables you to do is you can plug in your own resolvers. So, for example, if you've got some bit of some objects and you want to use AutoMocker like a factory to build those up, let's imagine that you are building a application with a DB context, and you've got a bunch of entity types, and you want to be able to just spit back instances of those entity types. You can build your own resolver that just always creates new instances. Let's imagine it's a to-do list, right? You build, to-do list item resolver. We can show this real quick. Private class to-do item resolver. Moq resolver. I am not happy with the interface name. The fact that it's called Moq resolver, I don't like, because most of our resolvers have nothing to do with mocks. But iResolver wasn't, it was too generic, so we had to put something there, and I'm not overly happy about it. So the idea with building your own resolver is quite simple. The context property will be feeding you in, and this is going to matter, the requested type. Okay? So for example, if somebody does mocker.get of iWeb service, you are going to be getting the generic of T for the type, right? If if a type being instantiated has a dependency, the type you will see is web service or MyDB context. It does mean that on here you may have to do something like is subclass of, or is assignable from, or is assignable to, or similar, right? So just be aware of that if you're doing this. Like, this gets down to the system type reflection APIs. So depending on what, usually just matching straight up is fine, depending on what it is, but be aware you might have to do that. If your resolver calls context.value and sets something, right? This will be the value that goes out. Calling the setter on the value property, see if it'll show it. Go. What? There we go. You'll note sets the value provided flag to true. Once the value provided flag goes to true, it stops walking through the list of resolvers, and that's the value that comes back. This was a kind of a big point of contention in the library when we were doing nullable reference types, because we really, like, you'll note this get method is declared non-nullable. And it will give you back a non-null instance, with the only exception being if someone creates a resolver like this and shoves it in, you can get a null instance back if a resolver forces a null through. And that was a part that we really struggled with, is trying to figure out, do we declare this thing nullable when in nearly every case it's going to be non-null, and the only time it's going to be null is if somebody does something really, really bad. Because in general, if you're creating your resolver, you probably aren't plugging in a null. If you write a custom resolver, you're probably plugging in an instance. And all the built-in resolvers return non-null. So it was one of those, is like, if we make it return nullable, which is technically correct, it means people have to do null checks all over the place when it's basically never null. And then the guidance becomes always, put a bang on the end of this, unless you've done something horrible with your resolvers. So things like that. So just be aware, you're usually going to get back non-null instances, except if somebody plugs in a resolver. So, but all the built-in resolvers are going to give you non-null instances. So just be aware of that. If you want to do any amount of customization of how items are created, and you want a callback behavior, right? The key thing is callback behavior rather than just inserting instances. If you just want to insert an instance, mocker.use, and you're done, right? The other common thing that comes up, right, is if we take our fake DB context, right? So we mocker use, something that does occur quite a bit is my DB context. So create the return value from create instance is not cached in that dictionary. So the return value from create instance. However, all of that thing's dependencies and any recursive dependencies are. Okay? So create instance is the only one that doesn't. If you call get instead of create instance, get will possibly create something for you, depending on what the type is. And it will be cached. So depending on which way you want it to go. But this pattern here, and I keep meaning to write an analyzer for it, haven't gotten around for it. This was somewhat common to want to do, because quite often, especially if you've built up some stuff with your AutoMocker, calling create instance and saying, yeah, this is the instance I want to use, you could either do this by plugging in your own resolver, or there's a nice little handy helper method here. There is mocker.with, and this is a fairly recent one, but you can just do mocker with, and mocker with is just shorthand for use passing in a create instance. Sounds like another stream. Analyzers are interesting and tricky. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. But this is the pattern here, right? If you call mocker use and the parameter that you're feeding into use is a create instance call, that is literally all the mocker with method does, right? It's literally calling use with create instance. That's it. It's syntactic sugar over use with create instance. Next version of AutoMocker, these aren't going to be void returning either. They're going to give you back the create instance result as well. Just because this pattern, I had to type it too much one day. And then that night, there may have been a PR with a with keyword added to the library. Because, darn it, I was getting tired of typing. At some point, would you mock an extension method with log error and ilogger? Oh, you're jumping ahead in that. Hold on. Hold, Benjamin. Give me 5 minutes. We're getting there. We're getting there. That's coming. Well, let me put it this way. It's not possible and it's forthcoming. So I'll let the, yeah. So these are equal. Okay. So happiness there, the resolver's callback there. Those are two things that I think are mildly convenient and nice. One other thing that I think is nice and something that I've started to lean into more on this library. So you will note here, I put in null checks because it is nice to be able to do null checks on your parameters. The problem is the code like this, if you run code coverage reports, which a lot of people do, most of the time, unless you write a test to pass in the null for each of these, you're going to see that 50% of these lines aren't covered. Because functionally, this double question mark is an if statement, says, okay, if this is null, then throw argument null exception. If this is null, then throw argument null exception. And unless you hit both sides of that if, the code coverage will say, you know what, you only hit 50% of your constructor. It's like, dang it. The problem is, writing those tests are very low value, right? Very low value. And I struggled with this because I'm like, I could get, some people just don't write the null checks because they're like, I don't want to hurt our code coverage and I'm not interested in writing a whole bunch of worthless tests. And they aren't completely worthless, but they're pretty worthless. Like, it usually, like, having or not having this argument null exception usually doesn't cause a bug. Sometimes it does because it blows up with a null ref later that you could have caught earlier. And more often than not, I see people get the name of parameter wrong, and it doesn't actually show the appropriate parameter name, which is annoying, right? So something in the AutoMocker library, if we go ahead and make this guy partial, this should harken back to last week's stream on source generators and community toolkit. AutoMocker comes with a source generator, soon to come with more source generators. So if we do constructor tests and we feed it the thing that we want to do the constructor test on, in this case, main window view model, what this guy is going to do, and I will go and open up my dependencies here and analyzers and AutoMocker test generator, is it is going to go through and it is going to write up a bunch of tests for me. Specifically, one test for every single one of my constructor parameters. And it is going to go through and it is going to pass null in for each of those parameters. So I realize this is kind of ugly and hard to read, but the key line is right here, right? This is the key thing, is it is asserting that it throws an argument null exception. It is very intentionally passing in default of the interface, which I've scribbled over now, which will be null, and it's passing in an instance for context that it used AutoMocker to create, right? So AutoMocker get is the source of the context, right? And that is what gets passed in, so the second parameter, and then it does an assertion to make sure that one, when I pass a null for my first parameter, I throw an argument null exception, and then two, does the parameter name match my expectation, right? This was my compromise. So now I can have my null checks without my code coverage suffering. And more importantly, I didn't have to write the worthless tests. Because these are, I should say worthless, very low value, low impact tests. So if you want to spam your unit test numbers and make it look like you've done a lot more than you actually have, source generator your unit tests. That's a thing, right? So this will go through and do it. It does have a small bit of magic. As long as your unit test project is referencing either MS test, NUnit, or XUnit, it will generate up methods and assert statements that match. If it cannot find one of the big three known unit tests projects being referenced, it will still gen these methods, but it will be up to you to actually invoke them at the appropriate place. Opening up a PR tonight on every project to test my code. Yeah. So again, this is my compromise of dealing with it. At some point, I may add a generic overload to this so that, because now that we have generic attributes, the only disadvantage is AutoMocker is backwards compatible, so this would have to be like an if-def situation, right? Because we can get away. What is the syntax for it? That. Oh, it's unhappy because there isn't a generic version of constructor test. Yes, of course there's not. It doesn't exist yet. But at some point, I may slap a generic one in just so that I can type the little alligator braces rather than type of and save myself a little bit of typing. So that is one of the other things that I love about AutoMocker is it will gen those tests for me, and it kind of gives a template of where things are going. Okay, so cool stuff that's forthcoming. I have everybody's favorite Get Kraken, and I've got PRs open. So that one doesn't count. We looked at logo, I options. Okay, so a common pattern that I really like doing with AutoMocker is building out extension methods for AutoMocker. Because AutoMocker is very easy to just shove stuff into, it's very easy to write extension methods that maybe populate it with some known types, right? So you can imagine if you've got a set of services that you're going to use repeatedly in a bunch of different tests, like I was saying before, you could write a common setup method that sets things up. But oftentimes what I find that I like better is writing an extension method targeting AutoMocker and just doing a bunch of use statements or similar to build up the right set of things into that dictionary. And that oftentimes ends up being the setup for my tests is these extension methods that then I can compose together. Because oftentimes I'll have them also return the AutoMocker instance so I can do a very fluenty like syntax and just ding, 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 right? And build those things up. One of the common things that comes up a lot is Benjamin's comment earlier about things like iLogger, iOptions, things that are somewhat common to use in a lot of different projects. The problem is the AutoMocker library is not going to take a dependency on those other libraries. Because AutoMocker is intended, the only dependency that it actually wants to take is Moq, and that's it. Like, obviously AutoMocker has to take a dependency on Moq. That's kind of a given. Though we could potentially even axe that now that I think about it. Regardless. But it is very common to have some set of extension methods on AutoMocker for potentially like doing logging validation or similar, right? And so the idea that I am experimenting with, I'm just gonna jump over here, reload. Okay, here's the idea that I'm experimenting with, and this is an open PR. So here is a test project, and this test project references the Microsoft extensions options library, right? So we've got this controller with options thing. It takes in an iOptions. That's it. Not a real exciting thing. And we can see in here, this guy has an AutoMocker instance. He's calling this magical new extension method called with options. And with options comes with a little callback delegate that lets you, it's optional, but it lets you assign some values into the options class. So this should look very similar to people who are used to dealing with iOptions in their setup with their iConfiguration, right? But you'll remember before what I was showing you is AutoMocker doesn't take a dependency on iOptions, right? If we look over here, there is no dependency at all on iOptions. In fact, I thought I had killed this one off too. I lied. Apparently we have a dependency on non-blocking. I should potentially look and see why if we can kill that. But there is no iOptions project reference or NuGet package at all. So the question is, where does this guy come from? So if we come over here and we expand this guy out and we look at our analyzers, AutoMock generators, you'll note there's this options extension source generator. And the idea here is a source generator is going to create an extension method on the AutoMocker instance. Again, this is an open PR, nothing's merged. So feedback welcome. But it goes through and registers up a bunch of the interfaces around iOptions that people might be using. Right? The common one is iOptions of T, and people forget that there's like other things you can do with it, like iOptions monitor, iOptions snapshot, all of these kind of more advanced use cases that all exist and don't get they don't get as much credit as they probably deserve, because there's some cool stuff. If you're not familiar with what all these things do, go Google it. There's some cool stuff with iOptions for knowing, you know, how to refresh and pull stuff and grab it and all that kind of stuff. So cool stuff. So, but this extension method now adds it in. And the idea here is this source generator only runs on projects that reference iOptions. And here's the cool part. You will note this project that it's generated into doesn't reference iOptions, but it references this project here, the generator's example. This guy here, there's a project reference to the example, and this guy references iOptions. So if it finds a reference to the options assembly, not necessarily the NuGet package, the assembly, because we don't, NuGet package implies assembly, but you know, somebody may have a hard reference or similar. It will go through, the source generator will go through and it will gen this out. Now, my intent is to do similar things for logging. Logging gets a little more interesting though, right? Because logging, specifically the iLogger interface, has a lot of cases where it will, the common use case for it is extension methods, right? Log error, log warning, log information, etc. But all of those extension methods kind of boil down into a single log method on iLogger, but you don't really want to write your setups and your verifies and all of that stuff against that. That's kind of So the end goal is going to be to have a similar source generator gen out relevant stuff for iLogger, preferably with a nice API. Now, the thing, 1 second, let me grab, there is the project that does not get enough, this guy. Yeah. Let's see. Thread sleep should not be used in tests. Yes, in general, thread sleep should probably not be used at all anymore. Task delay is much preferred if you need to slow something down for some reason. Thread sleep literally puts the thread to sleep, and that's rarely what you're after. Let's see. The existing way for I found to do this is but it's super ugly. And I'm sure Twitch won't help me with formatting. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So that sort of setup on iLogger is exactly the type of stuff that I don't want to write, because most people don't want to deal with all of that extra parameter matching. That's not what they care about. They want to write code that looks like this, right? This is the code that people want to write for your assertions, right? I want to verify that log information was called and it looks like this, right? This is what we want. And so this is a bit of inspiration that I'm taking this from. If you're already using Moq, feel free to plug this in. This library works great. It adds extension methods on top of Moq, specifically to go through and do verify iLogger stuff, where then you can verify, you know, log information, etc. Right? Because I've written similar things to what you have there, Benjamin, of doing all of that stuff, but yuck. I've got various things where I broke it down to where you can optionally pass in the expressions for each of those, so you don't have to specify them every time, but it's still not great. But I think some combination of that plus some combination of something similar to this is kind of what I want to see. For reference, the way this guy is doing it is, you'll note this is not the same verify method. So he's not hooking the same endpoint. What he's doing instead is, this is taking in an expression and he's parsing this expression himself. It's pretty, like, feel free to check out his code. It's pretty slick. And in order for that to work, it has to target these methods somewhat reflection-y like in order to do it, because there's not a great way to go after this. And it's unlikely to cause a problem, because how many people are going to write their own log information extension method that doesn't call the regular method for logging information? It's kind of weird. So, but this is kind of a very clever library. And if you want to use this with Moq and AutoMocker, you can pull this in. Like, there's nothing stopping you from doing this. This library just brings a bunch of extension methods on Moq of T that then you are off to the races to go and leverage. See, do all source generators add the exclude from code coverage? I believe the answer is yes. Yes. Is the so typically what will happen, and this is somewhat convention-y like, is code coverage tools previously have, from their inception, have often used convention as a way of detecting generated code, even before source generators exist, and will ignore generated code. One of the common conventions was .g.cs, and I'm realizing on my options one, it is not generating with a .g.cs, so I might have to just go fix that real quick. Because it is technically possible for generated code to make it into code coverage, but because of the way most code coverage things try to actively exclude generated stuff by default, it typically doesn't show up. I say typically, but it's not uncommon for generated code to put stuff, because there's comments that you can put at the beginning to indicate that you're generated. There's attributes you can decorate to indicate that you're generated, and then there's the file name. I think those are the big conventions I'm aware of. There could be more. Let's see. Should fields be private? Yes. I'm hedging slightly. The only time where I potentially expose fields is if they are static and read-only. So, for example, like, there's not a big issue with making like constants public, for example, because they can't functionally be changed. And I've found that there are times where I want to expose something that's basically a constant, like if I've generated a GUID and want it to be accessible in multiple places. So public, static, read-only field here. In those cases, I would say not private is fine, because it is functionally read-only and designed to function in the same way as a constant. Yeah, so yes, but in general, fields should definitely be private, typically only accessed via a property. And most of the time, the presence of fields have somewhat gone down with the addition of auto properties, because auto properties give you the benefits of a property and a field, and it's less typing. So oftentimes I don't create as many fields, because I'll usually just spin an auto property instead, and then it's kind of a moot point. Say it's the same way I get around a lot of people's naming conventions, because people bicker about the naming conventions for fields. I just make an auto property instead, and then the problem goes away. And the only time you absolutely need a field is in the case of if you're going to end up needing to use it as like a ref or an out later. But in those cases, it definitely should be private, because if you're using it as like an out or a ref, at that point you're indicating that it's writable, and so it definitely shouldn't be public. Pushing this code somewhere when you are done tonight. Ooh, don't mind, but I want to try something. Um, I'm trying to decide where I would push it. Where would I push it? Because I was gonna play around with the get crack and patch stuff. Kind of a cool use case for it. I don't know how well it's gonna work either. I figured out some of my get crack and patch issues. So for people who caught my stream a while back on that, apparently I had botched my install somehow, because a reinstall and the problem just magically vanished. So I went, oh, okay. So something. Does that work if you don't have a base repo? Well, that's what we're going to find out. That is what we are going to find out, because I honestly don't know. Yeah, so let's try this real quick. Boom. So let's see. cd cd dev temp cd, I think it was testing example. There we go. Git init. I think I have to make this like this. And then from here, let's see. I think I can just do this. Can I, what is it? Oh, GKC. Is it, I think it's graph show. Oh, screw it. Just gonna do this. Open repo, dev. I don't actually know what this is gonna do, so we're gonna find out together. I think. Let's see. Yeah. Let's see. Do you use an ORM? The let's see. The entity framework most of the time, specifically for database access. Most of the entity framework typically with Azure SQL and or SQLite. Okay, so if I click this button, because the base commit is empty with just a README there, right? So this is all new stuff. If I click this button, share, let's see. Anyone with the link? Oh, I got to give it a title. Testing example. This is a test. Great patch. Copy link. So I don't actually know what that's going to do. We're going to try this, and we're going to see what the heck that does. Open existing repo. Clone from repo URL. Oh, so it is going to need a base repo somewhere. I'm now real tempted to leave myself an empty repo. Oh, interesting. So it's going to want a repo. I'd love it if I could do it without a repo. Add that to my list. There's going to be a video forthcoming on some of this cloud patch stuff, by the way. So, it doesn't look like it works. Yeah, because it wants to open, and it's going to try to apply it, and it wants to match on the repo, and it doesn't have something to match on. So I imagine it's impossible for you to feed it an empty repo URL. Well, that's disappointing. Yes, I can push this somewhere. Stage testing example code. So we're going to do that. We're going to do that. Commit, push. Yeah, sure. Let's see. So we're going to go there. Testing example. Code samples from stream on the 1/17/2024. That way I can remember it. I think there's a setting for that. I don't know that Git Kraken. Yeah, default branch name. So if yours is falling back to master, that could be either in your own local Git config. Because I think it defaults to main on a clean machine. Yeah, but the only reason mine defaulted to master is I did git init on the command line. I didn't do it in Kraken. Right? Because I did this guy here. So at that point, it's no longer Git Kraken that's doing it. It is local Git config that's setting it up. So there is that. It claimed repo failed, but I now see dependent bot remote. So I'm going to go out on a limb and go with, yeah, repo's there. Let's see. For anyone who wants the link, I'm going to put it there. And then I will probably just immediately archive this project because I don't intend to. One, because I don't want to maintain this project and I don't want Dependabot spamming me. And so it will be in an archive state for what it is worth. That way it doesn't go anywhere. But yes, so long term, one of the plans for AutoMocker is to implement some variant of these so that you can have mocker.verify log, right, or similar. There's kind of an outstanding question. Do we just pull in this library? I mean, it has been touched in 3 years, but the iLogger interface hasn't changed in like that amount of time, so it's not like it really needs it. Or do we go through and do some sort of expression parsing ourselves or similar, blah, 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 blah. So there's a lot of questions on what is the appropriate thing to do here and how to properly handle it. iLogger is a little more complex than I would like it to be. Right? The other drawback is sometimes people don't take in an iLogger as their dependency. They take in iLogger factory and gen the logger themselves. So, for example, if I go here, pull this back, there is an outstanding issue over here. And you'll note here that this issue, Adam actually drops in a sample of his mock resolver. And this is a mock resolver that you can put in your project because your project is probably referencing iLogger. It is much more difficult for us to put it into AutoMocker proper because it would require us to take a dependency on iLogger, and we don't necessarily want to do that. So something like this, if you are wanting to do so, certainly works, right? You'll note it does some fun recursiveness with the generics to be able to build up the logger, and then something like this. And there is a chance that something like this gets tacked on, and especially now that we're starting in on the source generator approach, it is certainly something that could potentially make its way in, right? We could source generator something that's an extension method on Loggers Moq, there's also talk about being able to source generator in default Moq resolvers, because right now the Moq resolvers are just straight injected. You like, for reference, if anybody wants to contribute to this library, feel free. This is a very clean library. In my opinion, it's fairly well structured. There's lots of test coverage, so it's pretty hard to accidentally break things. But yeah, right now the resolvers are just straight up new list, right? Which is fine. It's fine. It's not great. It's fine. But I have thoughts on being able to have a default collection that could be added to or similar by like a source generator to be able to inject more. And then a lot of these, in theory, could be singleton instances to avoid any extra allocations or lazily loaded and that kind of thing. So there's extra stuff that could go along with this that is not there yet, but it is there and works rather well. And it, for the most part, like at one point in time, this entire project was 1.5. One. Yeah, that's too much. But yeah, and so things like the with keyword, you'll note, isn't a void return, but this is latest branch, not latest release. And there's a bunch of features that we're trying to pop in before the next release goes out, but we're kind of due for one. Like you can see the we don't release often. Like last released was January of 2023, so we're at a year. And the one before that was 6 months. It's because there's not a lot that needs to get added or is highly critical or whatnot. Like there haven't really been bugs around the library. So, but we picked up enough. We got another 1.5 million downloads. So it's time to kick a release, make it a little cooler, and go through and do it. And like I said, there's plenty of other libraries. I think there's another factory library whose name I'm blanking on that adds similar type automatic mocking functionality for Moq that a lot of people like using. And some people like it over AutoMocker because it also has built-in support for things like kind of like faker support, where it'll gen instance of fake objects with pre-canned data, which is great. There's nothing stopping people from plugging the libraries together too and mixing and matching. So we've tried to leave AutoMocker open enough to where people can extend it in whatever way that they need. So, okay. There's AutoMocker. Did I miss any features of AutoMocker that I wanted to cover? I think I hit everything. Oh, there was one that I skipped that I didn't cover. There is one last feature that is in here. If you have, this is going to look weird. If you have AutoMocker tracking disposable instances for you, you can do this. Or something similar to this, right? If you do as disposable, this will return back a disposable instance for you that when it is disposed, it will rip through all of those instances that AutoMocker knows about and call dispose on them. That's it. It's no more fancy than that. It's just because oftentimes if you're using like .with, .use, etc., you may inject a bunch of things that are iDisposable that you want cleaned up, right? And all AutoMocker does is give you this disposable bit to go through and do. This was another big point of API discussion of whether the AutoMocker itself should implement iDisposable, or whether you should have to make a call to get back a disposable. And ultimately, we decided on making a call to get back an iDisposable was a more intuitive approach for what was occurring rather than just having AutoMocker itself be iDisposable. The other drawback is if AutoMocker itself was iDisposable, analyzers that flag you for not cleaning up disposable things would then start flagging code like this, which was less than ideal. We didn't want... It's sort of on the developer to decide whether they need to clean up their disposable instances or not. Right? Especially in a testing context, it's not uncommon to have something that's iDisposable that doesn't really functionally have anything to clean up because it's a testing instance. Everything's in memory. So this is an option so that you don't have to like manually track and dispose all of your stuff. You can just do using var as disposable. I use underscore because just to indicate this variable name literally doesn't matter. I'm just setting a disposable scope. That's it. When this guy falls out of scope, clean up all the things and we're off to the races. And they all get cleaned up and is highly useful. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna just real quick before I get... Nope, stop it. Just gonna do a quick scan here to make sure I'm not missing anything weird. I think that's... Oh, there is one other thing. I know. I keep doing this. I need to stop it. Okay. So on our we don't have a good method here. Well, let's imagine we had void way too many string foo int bar double baz object don't care, etc. Right? So let's imagine we've got a thing that has way too many parameters on it. 4 is not way too many, but you get the point. In order to do a mock setup, what you would oftentimes do is you'd go mock setup, and then you do a I web service, and then you'd have to do XX way too many, and then you have to tell it inside of the expression what the parameter values are that you want to match on. And it's very common to not necessarily always care or not be able to know, right? So it is or it is any is the common thing. So it is any int, or I'm sorry, it is any string. It is any int. This is good. I'm already annoyed and I've only typed 2. It is any double. It is any object, right? So all this work, all this typing to build this out just so that we could do a setup. It's kind of a pain in the neck. So the AutoMocker does offer you a convenience method. Mocker setup, setup with any. You have to give it a generic because it needs to know what type to act on. And then you give it a name of, let's see, I web service way too many. Boom. So this uses some reflection-y magic and whatnot to go through and set it up. But functionally, it's going to do the exact same thing as this setup. It's just going to rip through all the parameters, shove an it is any in for each of them, and say, I just don't care. I want to set up on this method. I don't care about the parameters. Just give me the setup. We're moving on. Right? So not overly common to need this because you do have to do like a name of, because it has to find the method by string. Obviously, it doesn't play nice if you have multiple overloads. Multiple overlords is something different. Because if you have multiple overloads, it wouldn't know which overload you are intending, which is why mock makes you specify those so that the compiler can disambiguate which one you're going for. In this case, because it's all reflection based, it goes, just give me the string. And as long as it's not an overloaded method, it'll go, yeah, I got you. And it'll plug it in and build up the setup for you. So as long as that's all you care about, it'll work great. 2 parameters if there's a return type, and you're off to the races. And then you can get something with a very simple setup. So again, another one of those kind of just smoothing over features that I kind of wish was possible to do in a different way, because this kind of syntax is way too much typing. Way too much typing. So, okay, I think that's it. Yes, I think I covered everything. One last look. Set up with any, use, verify all with self mock, create any scope. Oh, I will call this out because the AutoMocker instance implements iService Provider. If you are referencing like the Microsoft DI libraries or anything that leverages them that adds extension methods on it, the extension methods aren't guaranteed to work. Right? If you call create scope, under the hood, create scope does get required service on service scope factory. Bear in mind, AutoMocker isn't going to know anything about that interface. So you call get required service, it falls all the way down to the mock resolver and goes, yep, I mock the factory. The default behavior of that mock factory is to do the return default on any invoked method. Create scope is going to return a default, and you end up getting a null scope all the way back out. So things like that show up, and I don't know how to properly resolve, right? So just be aware, even though AutoMocker implements iService Provider, it implements the interface. It's not a full DI container, right? If you want a full DI container, you're probably better off going something like this route. It's a little more heavy-handed. AutoMocker, I'll usually tell people, is a lightweight DI container. Lightweight. Doesn't have all the features, but does have a subset of features that are targeted for testing. That's its intent, right? That's where it's going. Okay. There we are. Cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming and hanging out. Hopefully that was useful for people. Trying to get through a bunch of various streams of content that people have requested over the last several months. So as always, if people have things that they're interested in, drop them in chat, shoot me a message, any of the, there, that one. You can find me at any of those links. If you're watching this on YouTube later, comment below. Let me know what you're interested in, because I do try to read and respond to all of them, at least for now while I have time, and then we'll go from there. Can't promise scheduling, but I can definitely promise it will get put on a list. So thank you, everyone. So, as always, it's been a pleasure. Ooh, what's coming next week? I hadn't decided yet. So we'll leave that as an open question. If there's requests, let me know, because I am happy to prep stuff. I will be honest, I have been spending a ridiculous amount of time on a private side project that hopefully there will be more to announce in the not too distant future. But in the short term, once again, I'll just tease it again real quick. I need one of these. Let's see. Get up. All right, 1 second. I gotta make sure I'm clicking on the right thing, because some of these are private, but this one's public. So, yeah. There's been a lot of commits going into private repositories underneath that org. A lot of commits. And Kaylin's been absolutely killing it on some of this stuff. So if you are at all interested in doing quick, we'll say better version of Click Once installer cross-plat, definitely check this out. The latest update that just came out on Tuesday adds a lot of cool stuff. The performance and size decreases that he has pulled out of it are absolutely impressive. A lot of the tools have been, well, Here, I'll just show, because this is a public repo. I can show this. So a lot of tooling has been rebuilt in Rust, and you can see how tiny a lot of these have gotten themselves down to. So pulling one of these guys, open file. Oh, yeah. So the actual updater itself has gotten really, really tiny. And there's only more improvements coming. So if you were interested, check it out. And if you try it on one of your projects and something doesn't work, please post issues, post in the Discord. Because trying to make sure that things are covered, because it's been a pretty major refactor. And unfortunately, it's hard to test all of the cases. Dev home should be a good topic someday. Ooh, that is a good idea, Andrew. I like it. Yeah, there were some really slick demos I saw at Ignite. I was talking with one of the PMs on it. Pretty cool. So, yes, I agree. Okay. I realized I was talking that whole time thinking I was showing stuff. Okay, I dropped the link at least. If you go to the actions, you can see the size updates on each of the individual updater packages.